Hi, and welcome back to The Lowest Crime, the podcast all about true crime from one of the lowest countries in the world, the Netherlands. I'm Eline, and today's case, although Dutch, takes us abroad. It takes place in Thailand, but the man at the center of the story is Dutch, and ultimately, it was the Dutch court that decided his fate. So, even though the events themselves happened abroad, this is still very much a case that belongs in this podcast. Please be aware that today's episode discusses domestic violence and the death of a young woman, so listener discretion is strongly advised. And just a reminder, I do my very best to bring you all the known facts, but I am just an amateur podcast creator, so there is always a chance of me making a mistake. With that being said, this is the story of Rose Sulaiman. It is the 10th of October 2008. And a woman in Thailand is renovating her rental home. One of the problems that needed tackling was the cesspool. It wasn't draining properly. The cesspool in this case was essentially a pit connected to the toilet system, where waste would collect. And when it becomes too full, it has to be emptied. So the woman called a worker to take care of it. The cesspool was a large, round structure located right next to the house, about a meter from the outer wall. It was sealed with a heavy lid, cemented shut, with a smaller opening on the top that was also closed off. When the worker arrived, the smaller opening at the top was opened, so a hose could be inserted to pump out the contents of the cesspool. But as the process went on, something didn't seem right. There was resistance, as if something was stuck. So he pulled the hose back to see what was going on. And when he did, something came up with it. Attached to the hose was a bra, and attached to the bra were human ribs. He was immediately alarmed and decided to open up the entire pit, and when he did, he saw even more bones, including a human skull. That was the moment that the Thai police became actively involved. Through DNA testing and dental records, it was determined that these were the remains of Rose Sulaiman. Rose Sulaiman was a 36-year-old woman originally from Malaysia. She was married to a Dutch man named Bert den Day, and together they had a 3-year-old son. Although they had lived in Thailand, they hadn't always been there. For some time they had stayed in the Netherlands, where their son was born. But Rose was not granted a residence permit, which meant that they couldn't stay there. So not long after the birth of their son, the family left the country and eventually settled in Thailand. There, they were part of a small expat community, and on the surface they seemed to be building a pretty good life for themselves. But that was far from the truth. Life in Thailand was difficult. Bert became unemployed fairly quickly, and while Rose tried to bring in some money by teaching English, it wasn't enough and money was tight. Over time, cracks began to appear in the relationship, something people around them started to notice as well. Witnesses later described arguments and tension, and some people even spoke about signs that Rose was being hurt. Multiple people later stated that Rose had confided in them that she was being abused. Some had even seen the bruises on her body. One witness described how Rose had shown her injuries, explaining that they were caused by her husband. And what makes this detail even more striking is what was found later. After Rose's death, photographs were discovered in the house, and they showed parts of her body with visible bruising. On the back of those photos, the words "home abuse" had been written. And those photos would later become important because they didn't just suggest that something was wrong, but they supported what Rose herself had been telling people. The conflict between Bert and Rose was building, and Rose wanted to leave. She wanted to return to Malaysia, back to her family, and she wanted to take her son with her. According to witness statements, this was something that Bert strongly disagreed with. The idea that his son might leave with her, possibly permanently, was something that he did not accept. On the evening of November 8th, 2007, Rose called her mother. She told her that there had been another fight that day, and that she had been attacked, and that she was scared. She said that she wanted to come home, and that she would return to Malaysia with her son. Her mother urged her to come immediately, but Rose replied that she couldn't. It was raining heavily and her son was unwell. She would leave the next day. But not long after that, about 15 minutes, she called again. This time she was crying, panicked. She told her mother, "If you don't hear from me within a week, go to the police." She thanked her mother for everything, and then the call ended. And that was the last anyone ever heard from Rose. After that night, she disappeared. There were no calls, no messages, no more signs of life. And so, although anxious, her mother did what her daughter asked. She waited, hoping she would arrive in Malaysia. But she did tell her children what had happened and also informed her daughter-in-law. So the next day, on November 9th, that daughter-in-law tried calling Rose's mobile phone, but there was no more dial tone. Still, her mother waited until November 11th. Then she called the house again, and this time Bert answered the phone. Communication was difficult because he did not speak Malay and she did not speak English or Dutch. But he did manage to communicate to her that Rose had gone to Malaysia. And although this sounded plausible, after all, Rose had said herself that she wanted to go back there, the fact that she had left her 3-year-old son behind made it feel very, very wrong. So at first her mother still held out hope that her daughter might still arrive. But she never did. And there were no records of Rose ever leaving Thailand after November 1st. Rose had told her, "If you don't hear from me within a week, go to the police." But even after that week had passed, there was still uncertainty. Distance, language barriers, and the hope that she might still show up delayed any immediate action. And because of that and the complexity of the situation, it would take months before a formal missing persons report was filed in February 2008. In the meantime, Bert continued telling people the same story, that she had left and that she had gone to Malaysia. He told some people even that they were still in contact via email. At the same time, his actions raised questions. He never reported her missing. He never searched for her, and he never asked authorities for help. Instead, he just continued living his regular life. About a month later, he went to Thailand with his son and traveled to Europe, eventually returning to the Netherlands, where he rebuilt his life. And for a long time, Rose remained missing. Until that October 10th, 2008. Until the new people living in the house in Thailand had to empty their house's cesspool. Everyone's fear became reality. Rose had never gone back to Malaysia. She had been there all along, hidden in a pit just meters from the home that she had shared with her husband and her son. A pit that had been sealed, cemented shut, making the possibility of a natural or accidental death very, very unlikely. So, one very crucial question remained unanswered. How had she died? But due to the advanced stage of decomposition, both Thai forensic experts and later the Dutch Forensic Institute were unable to determine a cause of death. There was simply not enough left of the body to establish what had happened. And that made this case extremely complex, because although there were very strong and very real suspicions against Bert, without a cause of death, how do you prove that somebody was murdered? For years, the case stalled. Bert was no longer in Thailand, and the investigation didn't move forward. However, during this time, the case did receive some attention in the Netherlands. Dutch crime journalist Peter R. de Vries looked into what had happened and traveled to Thailand, where he spoke to people connected to the case. He also confronted Bert in the Netherlands, asking him directly about Rose's disappearance and death, but of course, Bert denied any involvement. And despite of this renewed attention, the case still didn't move forward at the time. It wasn't until 2015 that Thai authorities asked the Netherlands to take over the case. And so, a new investigation began. Witnesses were interviewed again, evidence was re-examined, and the remains were studied again. And finally, in 2016, nearly 9 years after Rose's disappearance, Bert was officially arrested. He still denied everything. He still said that she had left for Malaysia and said that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. His case went to trial in 2019, nearly 12 years after Rose's disappearance. By the time the case reached the court, it was already clear that proving what had happened would be difficult. There was no cause of death, no clear timeline of what had happened inside the home, and much of the case relied on witness statements and reconstruction only. And so at trial, the defense zoomed in on that lack of clarity. Because no cause of death could be established, they argued that it couldn't even be proven that Rose had been the victim of a crime at all. There was no definitive evidence of how she had died, no direct evidence placing Bert at the moment of her death, and without that, they argued, there was simply not enough evidence to convict anyone. The court acknowledged that the situation was highly suspicious, but suspicion alone was not enough to reach a conviction, and so, in 2019, Bert was acquitted. But the case didn't end there. The prosecution appealed, and the appellate court approached it differently. They acknowledged something important. It was true that they could not determine exactly how Rose had died, and it was also true that they did not know the exact sequence of events that had led to her death. But that didn't mean nothing could be proven. Instead, they began with a different question. Not what exactly happened, but what could not have happened. They systematically went through every possible scenario. They first asked, could she have died of an accident or natural causes? The answer to that was clear, no. That did not fit the reality of where and how she was found. Rose's body wasn't discovered in a place where someone might collapse or pass away unnoticed. She was found inside a cesspool next to her home, a space that had been closed off and cemented shut. And so it was reasoned that it was not plausible for someone to die a natural death and then somehow end up hidden in a concealed pit. This scenario simply didn't explain the way her body was concealed. So the next question was, could it have been an accident? But again, the answer was no, based on the same explanation as before. And finally, could it have been suicide? And again, how does one end up in a concealed cesspool after suicide? One by one, these possibilities were ruled out. So then, there was only one scenario remaining, and that is that she died as a result of violence inflicted by another person. So, now that murder or manslaughter could be proven, who could have done it? The court very carefully examined that possibility too. Could an unknown person have entered the property, killed her, hidden her body in the cesspool, sealed it and left, all without Bert knowing? Given the layout of the house, the surrounding walls, and the fact that Bert was living there at the time, the court found that scenario extremely unlikely. So that just left no realistic alternative. The only person who could have done it was Bert. And that is how the court reached its conclusion. Not by proving exactly what happened, but by showing that everything else was impossible, or implausible at least, and that only one realistic scenario remained. And although the court in the end was sure Bert deserved to go to prison, the decision was still a very hard one, because sitting in the courtroom was also Bert and Rose's son. By that point, he was no longer a child, he was a young adult. And he had grown up believing something very different about his mother. He had been told that she had left, that she had chosen to go away. And now, years later, he was faced with the possibility that the truth was something else entirely. During the trial, he spoke. And what he said wasn't about evidence or timelines or legal reasoning. It was simply about what this decision would mean for him. Because if the court was right, then sending his father to prison would mean losing the only parent he had left. He had already lost his mother, and sending his father to prison meant that he would lose him as well. This made the decision for the judges a lot more loaded and emotionally complicated. And so they addressed it in court. They stated that the fact that this young man has already grown up without his mother, and that a conviction would take away his father as well, was something that they did not ignore. It was part of the weight of the decision. But at the same time, there was another reality. A woman had died. Her body had been hidden, and for years the truth had been obscured. The court ultimately concluded that despite the impact on the son, the evidence left no other reasonable explanation, and that meant that they had to act on that conclusion. So, Bert Dende was convicted of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 12 years and 6 months in prison. Although justice was finally served, this still remains a tragic ending for so many reasons. First, of course, Rose's life was lost, but also her son being told that she had left him, and then finally the only person he had left and trusted turned out to have lied to him all that time. And that is something no verdict can undo. And that is it for today. Thank you all so much for listening. If you appreciated this episode, feel free to give it a like, leave a comment, or share it with someone who you think might appreciate the podcast as well. If you would like to support me even more, there's a Patreon page in the description. Thank you all so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.